Kia ora, I'm Sharon Brett Kelly, and this is the sound of sea ice in the Antarctic. It is not the only thing cracking under pressure on the frozen continent. The US's Antarctic program is facing massive cuts that could spill over into New Zealand. At a time when research in Antarctica is revealing so much about the impact of the climate crisis on our planet.
This is such a fast-moving, chaotic time.
Time's just not on our side, so that's why it's really potentially going to be a blow to what we do.
If cuts do happen to the National Science Foundation, it is hard to see how it wouldn't impact New Zealand research in Antarctica.
But the message from the experts, it's not too late. RNZ's Our Changing World presenter Claire Concannon has seen firsthand what's going on. She was there in November and she's just made a 6-part documentary series on sea ice.
I like places that make me feel really small and inconsequential. I kind of seek them out with hiking and being in the ocean and stuff. And Antarctica definitely did that for me. And then there was also these moments of calm from absolute silence. Like if you're away from the base and any, vehicles or machinery and there's no wind, it's completely silent. That was, the immediate feeling after the experience. But then when I kind of came back into the world, this sense of urgency kicked in to tell this story because it seemed like such a time of change for Antarctic sea ice.
Tell me about your Voice of the Sea Ice series. I mean, a whole mini-series on sea ice. Why do we need so much about sea ice?
I know, right? Ice is ice, isn't it? It's frozen water. What more is there to say?
Exactly.
Actually, it turns out, Sharon, quite a bit.
That's an iceberg. These gigantic, beautiful, complex ice formations. I don't care about icebergs.
This is sea ice expert and comedian Will Hobbs.
See the dull, flat scum in front? That's sea ice. That's what I'm passionate about. That's what gets me up in the mornings. Sea ice is frozen seawater. It typically grows to 1 or 2 meters thick, and it lasts for just a few months. It's superficial, it's grey, it's kind of salty.
There's these 3 characteristics of sea ice that makes it important for the planet's climate, globally. And that is the fact that it's white, it's whiteness, it's blanketness, I've been calling it, its insulation properties, and its saltiness. And those coupled with the fact that it just covers such a huge area, like in the winter time, Antarctic sea ice has, across the records that we've had, the median area that it goes out to is like 18 million square kilometers. So it's a huge area, and the whiteness reflects sunlight back into space. So in the summertime, it prevents extra heat going into the ocean. And then the blanketness keeps the heat in the ocean during the winter time so that heat doesn't move from the relatively warmer water into the really cold air, which would, if it does happen, increases storminess. And then the saltiness is because when the ice forms, salt is kind of rejected in the process and it creates this really cold, dense, briny water that drives global ocean currents. It's this wild, makes up more than a third of the water that's in the deep parts of the ocean. And so that's just the physics of it, because then it's also this habitat for a couple of different layers of the food web, the complicated food web that's there in Antarctica. And then it also has another role as acting as a barrier in front of those ice shelves and preventing waves from getting at them, which would cause them to calve off and which would potentially increase the rates of icebergs that you would get, which then increases the flow of ice down onto the ice shelves, which increases the rate of melting, which then leads to more sea level rise.
What was interesting is that each time you released an episode about this, there was a news story talking about how bad things really were in Antarctica.
Yeah, I guess the whole series kicked off because I was at this media briefing in October 2023 when a whole bunch of New Zealand scientists were kind of ringing the alarm bells and saying, this is the lowest winter sea ice extent we've had on record by a long shot. And so that's what kicked everything off for me. And then we started releasing this series in early March of this year. And in February, there were headlines that we had hit the lowest ever global sea ice.
A planet on thin ice when it comes to climate change. Copernicus, Europe's climate service, issued a warning Thursday. Global sea ice hit a record low in February. They say it's the thinnest on record, after receiving data from both the Antarctic and the Arctic. The change in ice cover was most pronounced this time of year in the Antarctic, where it was 26% below average in February.
And then in early March, we got the summer sea ice extent for Antarctica, and it was the second lowest on record.
The Antarctic sea ice reached an annual minimum extent of 1.98 million square kilometers.
And then in early April, we had the lowest ever winter sea ice extent. It's just headline after headline about sea ice reaching these new record lows. Now, the caveat here is that the satellite record that we have is 47 years old. So when you think on timescales of Earth's system and Antarctic ice, that's quite small. But
we've seen some very rapid and extreme changes taking place in Antarctica in recent times. So there have been heat waves where the temperature has been about 40 degrees above average. There's been record low sea ice levels last year. Scientists were describing it as a once in 7.5 million year event.
The researchers will say that the declines that we've seen, this kind of plummeting drop off the cliff in the last couple of years, is so dramatic that it indicates this shift in regime change for Antarctic sea ice, like nothing they've seen before.
I've just seen a story from Nature magazine that, with the headline, "Does US Science Have a Future in Antarctica?" Then subhead, "Trump cuts threatened to cancel field work," and more. And I'm just wondering, given that it's such a collaborative effort in Antarctica, the research and the science that goes on there, does that have an impact on these international researchers on the continent?
If cuts do happen to the National Science Foundation, and that Nature article that you referenced, they said that the money was going to be cut for the refurbishment of the McMurdo base. If those cuts do come, it is hard to see how it wouldn't impact New Zealand research in Antarctica, because Scott Base is extremely close to McMurdo Base, and there's a huge amount of collaboration that happens on the science program level. So some of the research that I covered, that was joint research between New Zealand and US teams, but also a huge amount on the logistical side of things. Like, if you think about trying to do science in Antarctica, there's a huge amount of work that goes on behind the scenes to have the bases there, to keep them running, to have the infrastructure, to have the safety that you need. You know, the US team maintains the South Pole Highway across the Ross Ice Shelf, making sure that there's no crevasses there that are going to be a danger. So it would be hard to see, if the cuts come through at the extent that they seem to be signalled at, it would be hard to see that it wouldn't have an impact. You know, the US, Christchurch is the gateway for US science in Antarctica, and even the ice cube neutrino at the South Pole. You know, there are researchers at the University of Canterbury who are a part of a team involved in working with the data that comes out of there. So Yeah. I don't have any definitive answers, but it's difficult to see how it wouldn't impact New Zealand science.
In fact, a new US-NZ joint project has just been announced with our government funding up to $5 million over 5 years. But the uncertainty over future US funding is so sensitive that the director of the Antarctic Research Project, Rob Mackay, declined to talk to the detail. In an email, he says the two countries have worked together in Antarctica since the 1950s, and they are working on the assumption that US support and collaboration will be ongoing. But let's hear from Waikato University's Gary Wilson.
It really does come down to the challenge of why would it be important that we're just not putting enough money into Antarctic research? And the reason fundamentally is the scale at which Antarctica can affect the rest of the planet, and the challenge of the fact that there are tipping points that are like one-way valves. Once you pass through these things, you can't go back. You know, when you melt ice, it's pretty hard to make it again on a warming planet. So there are certainly challenges there that really need some investment, and that's where we're really stuck, because now is not the time to reduce it. In fact, now is the time to think that if we really want to make a difference, we've got to invest at scale. And it's the sort of thing that I think Europe's starting to step up to. Things I hear about Horizon Europe and the level of funding into scientific research is increasing, so that's promising.
Gary's the president of the Scientific Committee on Antarctic Research, or SCAR, which leads and develops all the scientific activities among the 40-odd countries. They've just met in London.
Time's just not on our side, so that's why it's really potentially going to be a blow to what we do. But also, I think, the US isn't the only one. We're all struggling a bit with respect to funding as we've come out of the COVID years, and we're trying to kind of restart economies around the world. I think quite a few countries are making choices as to how they spend money. The challenge for us is that Antarctica can't wait. I mean, we're already seeing the planet, yet last year it reached 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and it's kind of on track to be another degree warmer in the next decade or 15 years. So time is just not on our side here.
And is it that, when you say this is bad timing with this uncertainty over funding, is it that you're really starting to make important breakthroughs in your understanding of the impact of climate change in Antarctica, with the big studies that go on into sea ice, for example?
So the uncertainty plays out in a few different ways. One of the biggest challenges, of course, working in Antarctica is that there are long lead-ins to the programs, lots of planning, lots of assembling the logistic capability and resources to undertake the work. So uncertainty kind of delays us to the point where things just can't go ahead till there's some certainty. The other issue is the situation changes quite quickly. So yes, we're making discoveries, but we're also watching a climate system and a climate state that is changing every year. So, the agreements that we made 20 years ago as to how to limit and what time trajectories we've got for CO2 reduction pathways are no longer fit for purpose, because we haven't met them and the planet is warming at a faster rate than ever.
Because of this uncertainty, does it mean that projects involving New Zealand scientists are also up in the air?
Well, New Zealand has always been highly collaborative in how it undertakes its research. So it's brought in many nations, often the US, but also South Korea, China, the United Kingdom, Japan. We've worked collaboratively right since the early days of Scott Base. So if you go back to the first drilling program, the Dry Valley Drilling Project in the 70s, that was jointly with the US and with Japan. And that allows us to work at a scale that is greater than New Zealand could afford on its own. And so losing a partner out of those sorts of projects will make things challenging. That said, through SCAR, there are 46 different nations. So 2032, there's a plan now for the 5th International Polar Year. So we're working to develop large collaborative programs to happen over the 2030 to 2032 period. So it's really just for now the uncertainty that is unsettling.
Is it the Trump regime? Because we're hearing about cuts all over the place.
I don't really want to get into the politics because it really comes down to what we can do as an international agency and how we can work with the resources we've got. And to be honest, we're struggling with some cuts and some decisions that government is making in New Zealand. And the government's been very open that it's not going to invest a greater amount into research at the moment. And they argue that that's because the economy won't allow it. But there's a little bit of chicken and egg when it comes to knowledge economy. You've got to invest in generating the knowledge to be able to develop it to economic benefit.
Well, New Zealand may be scrimping on its allocation to Antarctic research, but there's a nod to the importance of the region geopolitically in the latest report on defence spending. Here's Canterbury University's specialist on Antarctic governance, Alan Hemmings.
We already have a military where all of its limited pieces of kit have been justified in part, not solely, but in part, for their use in the Antarctic. And if you look at the Defence Capability Review, that has 7 references to the Antarctic, 9 to the Southern Ocean, and 1 to the Ross Dependency. And it talks about how this area and the Antarctic Treaty System is coming under pressure and strategic competition. And then it mentions some areas of future expenditure, and each one of those is coupled to the Antarctic and or the Southern Ocean. So the 757 replacement argument also refers to their Antarctic support role. And then interestingly, the quote, long-range remotely piloted aircraft and the Southern Ocean patrol capability are both identified as being relevant to the Antarctic and the Southern Ocean. So you could say that one consequence of this increasing international pressure to spend more on defence is already visible in this New Zealand decision to invest in certain things, part of whose function will be to operate in the Southern Ocean. So this is not a completely new thing, but I think there's some evidence of its acceleration.
Alan says it's all happening at a crucial time, with the annual Antarctic Treaty meeting in Milan just weeks away.
We've had a number of years where essentially nothing has been able to be agreed at these meetings. It looks even less likely that we'll get agreement at this meeting because US officials are focused on their churn around their organisations and their own job prospects. The Antarctic is a long way down the food chain as far as people like Trump and Rubio and Musk are concerned. But we'd like to see progress on tourism management or other environmental issues at that Milan ATCM. What we can expect, because we've seen this with the tariffs, is the relationship between the Americans and the Chinese is getting much worse, and that will be reflected in the Antarctic. Whether this means that they are kind of sparring with each other openly, or that it just means that we have a block on doing anything, who can tell? Given that we don't know how Trump arrives at any decision, and he almost just crashed the US stock market, is it out of the question that the US during the Trump term would abrogate the Antarctic Treaty? Is it possible that they'd abrogate parts of the Antarctic Treaty? And specifically one thinks of the prohibition on mineral resource activities. And thirdly, could the US, notwithstanding the fact that you're not supposed to do this under the Antarctic Treaty, could a Trump US, which is concerned with territory all over the world, as we've discovered, decide that it's going to assert a territorial claim in the Antarctic? These would have been ridiculous things for me or anybody else to suggest just a few years ago. I don't think they're any longer completely ridiculous. I hope they're still moderately ridiculous.
Back to the sea ice with Claire Concannon.
You know, when you're there, and this is the thing, which it seems obvious to say, but sometimes it's hard to wrap your brain around. Antarctica is a continent. It's huge, and when you're there, you're in a very small part of it, and you're not visibly seeing the effects of climate change. And when I talk about this sea ice decline, the majority of this area extent decline that we're seeing is on that big scale of the pack ice way out to sea, that when they look by satellite using microwave energy, that they can see that has retreated back. And so I think you don't have to go there. I think the biggest thing for me was talking to these researchers and then looking at some of that data. And once you start doing that, or these visualizations, and once you start doing that, you can see what's happening. Whereas when you're there on the ground, you don't see it. And I think that is one of the complexities of talking about climate change and communicating around it. Until we have these extreme weather events, it's not something that you can see happening day to day.
What about the scientists, though? Because they've been doing this research in Antarctica for years and years and years, and yet we're told that the climate crisis is getting worse. So how do they feel? Is their work worth it? How do they stay hopeful?
It's a great question, and I think the real answer is some of them definitely do remain hopeful and others don't. And when I was having these conversations with these earth and climate scientists, they would have this science answer, when I would ask them about climate change in Antarctica. And then I would stop and ask, well, how do you feel about it? And Sharon, some of them were really scared and quite pessimistic. And especially, I will say, I was there in November. And so the US election had just happened. And there were a lot of people who were aware that because Donald Trump had been elected, that the US would be pulled out of the Paris Agreement, which is our global effort to try and reduce our emissions and combat climate change. And so there was that pessimism in some of the researchers that I spoke to, but definitely others that were hopeful. And they would say, we have the solutions that we need. They already exist. We just need the political and public will to implement them. And they would be very keen to stress that this isn't a binary thing, like you miss a target. 2024, we heard, was the first year that global temperatures went over 1.5 degrees since pre-industrial temperatures. And that's not an excuse to say, oh, well, it's done now. They would say, the thing about climate change is how rapidly the warming happens. And the warming is happening now. Some of the changes are locked in, but every reduction in emissions helps us down the line.
At this point, simply getting to carbon zero and reducing our emissions from burning of fossil fuels down to zero means that we are not going to get far enough. Because the planet has already added to that. So we need to start thinking about the idea of carbon negative. And to do that, I don't mean getting into how we take CO2 out of the atmosphere in a technical sense. I mean, actually, the planet does it naturally, and there are an awful lot of carbon sinks that we have not paid attention to, that we could start to pay attention to. So there are tools available to us that we could use to start to make a difference. We're just not making good enough progress on it.
Gary Wilson there, ending today's podcast. Thanks also to Claire Concannon and Alan Hemmings. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and NZ On Air. This episode was produced by Alexia Russell and engineered by Rangi Powick. I'm Sharon Brett Kelly. Mā te wā.